Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those joining us in Europe and elsewhere. My name is Tess Davis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Antiquities Coalition, and thank you for joining us today. This month marks 1 year since Russian forces invaded Ukraine, and among the many tragedies taking place in that war, including the countless lives lost, the communities and even entire cities leveled, and the ruin of the economy, is the plunder and destruction of the country's rich cultural heritage. According to UNESCO, over 230 sites of cultural significance have been recorded as damaged or destroyed to date. And last month, it was reported that more than 15,000 pieces of art and artifacts have been pillaged. Notably, a collection of Scythian gold dating to the 4th century was stolen from a local museum in Melitopol, in addition to nearly the entire collection of the Kherson Regional Art Museum. An expert to the Smithsonian Institution has warned that this pillage is a purposeful Russian move with specific paintings and ornaments targeted and taken out to Russia. And while priceless to the Ukrainian people, of course, these treasures have the potential to be a valuable commodity to the cash-strapped Russian state, and thus may greatly undermine the US-led sanctions regime. The United States has a unique opportunity and responsibility to be part of the international response. And this is because the $28 billion American art market remains the largest in the world, making up 43% of the total, and is thus the likely end destination for licit and illicit art from Ukraine or elsewhere. Other areas of conflict. When faced with similar crises, Washington has closed U.S. borders to suspect material by requiring that at-risk imports have proof of legal export, and moreover, authorizing law enforcement to seize those that do not. The simple but effective step has made a major difference in past crises, but it's yet to happen today for Ukraine. So again, a year into the Ukrainian war, the Antiquities Coalition wanted to convene some of our partners and cultural heritage experts to reflect on what responsibility we all have and discuss strategies for how we can support the international community can support those in Ukraine and their cultural heritage in the months and even years ahead. Our speakers today include Dr. Kate Harrell is an archaeologist working in international cultural heritage protection. She has extensive professional experience working in mission-focused organizations, including academic, nonprofit, and U.S. government enterprises. Kate is currently an investigator with the Conflict Observatory, a nonprofit consortium funded by the U.S. Department of State, which seeks to research and document Russian perpetrated war crimes in Ukraine. Dr. Sam Hardy is a cultural property criminologist with experience of interdisciplinary fieldwork in Kosovo, Cyprus, Turkey, and Jordan, and works with UNESCO and NGOs as well as universities, including collaborative teaching and training. Dr. Chris Gasparo is a geographer and archaeologist specializing in cultural property protection and transnational security issues on the faculty of the U.S. Naval War College. And Damian Koropeckyj is a consultant in cultural heritage risk management. He previously worked as a senior analyst at the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab at the Virginia Museum of Natural History. And his research on the exploitation of cultural heritage in conflict has been presented to the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield and members of the UK Parliament. So thank all of you for joining us today, and also those who are in attendance in the audience. To start us off, I wanted to pose a question to Dr. Gasparo. Chris and his colleague Daniel Schultz were the author of our Antiquities Coalition policy brief, How Does Russia Exploit History and Cultural Heritage for Informational Warfare? Recommendations for NATO. And this document examined how historical propaganda and the exploitation of cultural heritage has become a critical component of the Kremlin's information warfare program, targeting not just Ukraine, but actually NATO's entire eastern flank. And Chris, I was hoping you could speak more about what you found in the course of writing this brief, and also your wider work, and why it should concern those of us in countries like the United States and United Kingdom, and those who represent us in government. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tess. First thing before I start, I have to disclaim that these comments are my own and not positions of the Naval War College or U.S. government. I think from the perspective of this webinar and in general, the important thing to realize is that topics of looting and cultural heritage destruction are not merely those of damages of war or criminal activities, but they're part of a wider conduct of warfare today, and particularly the information and disinformation parts of war. I think what we've been seeing a year into this conflict is that as the initial Russian expectations of a quick victory did not turn out, I mean, not only having just more destruction as the conflict has persisted, but we see two trends which I think are important to keep in mind. First, there's an accelerating reaction to Russian activities, particularly in the areas of monument construction and deconstruction. So in the Baltics and Ukraine, for example, we see a lot of Russian and Soviet monuments being taken down, and then in Russian occupied areas of Ukraine, old Soviet and monuments being put up, or new monuments being put up on the site of Ukraine monuments. So there's a competition over the symbolism and meaning of history that's playing out in the area of material culture. And then, even though the Russian kind of historical information and propaganda themes have stayed consistent, we've seen shifts in emphasis as the conflict has gone on. And we've seen, a shift from focus on World War II, neo-Nazis and the Ukrainian government, to more focus on kind of medieval Russian and imperial narratives, and by extension, the storyline that Russia has always been kind of under assault by the West for 1,000 years, and this is playing out as this is not a war against Ukraine anymore, but it's a war against NATO and a war against the war against the West, which is part of this history of Western aggression against Russia. And this line there are two I think effects that the Russians want from this. One is to focus on this war as kind of an Anglo-American dominated thing, which is also kind of having the EU be a pawn of the United States and Britain, and that's an attempt to weaken support places like France, Italy, Spain, other parts of Europe, and also playing on a history of Western imperialism and using that to appeal to audiences in places like China, India, and Africa in order to erode support for any international actions and sanctions against Russia. And then also, as we see counter reactions with monuments and stuff being torn down in the Baltics and Ukraine, this is then portrayed as evidence of Russophobia and attempts to, once again, kind of erase Russian culture and respect for Russia. And so of these, I think there are three key points to remember. First, this is all part of a global fight for influence between the various combatants in this conflict. Second, with these narrative shifts in emphasis, particularly as the conflict being more portrayed as one of Russia against NATO, it raises the level in which things are being pictured as an existential fight, which could lead to increased risk of escalation, but certainly signals that there's probably no easy end to this conflict anytime soon. And thirdly, that history and historical narratives and their physical manifestations, for example, in artifacts and monuments, is a big part of contemporary warfare. So this, I think, has two implications. One for policymakers and military strategists, that we need to take very seriously the idea that history is part of the battle space now. And then secondly, and this goes to the article that Kate and Damian just wrote for Antiquities Coalition, that cultural heritage professionals are going to get pulled into this conflict, whether over, whether to keep monuments or not, things related to looting and trafficking. But as history is becoming extremely weaponized in conflict today, cultural heritage professionals, really are no longer external objective observers. And this is going to challenge cultural heritage professions in how they manage their roles, both as disciplines and individuals within these conflicts. So I will leave it there. I'm sorry I have to drop off, but my colleagues I think are more than capable of answering any questions and correcting any mistakes I may have made.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. And that provides a good segue, I think, to Dr. Harrell. I was hoping that you could, Chris mentioned the policy brief that you just wrote for the Antiquities Coalition. And I was hoping you could tell us a bit about that for those who may not be familiar with it, and also a little bit about the work of the Conflict Observatory and specifically what you're doing with the situation in Ukraine. Thank you.
Hi, great. So Damian and I co-authored a think tank paper. It was published in December. The link is on the Antiquities Coalition website. So we encourage you to go read it, or at least the executive summary, and see if this pertains to you in the audience. But let me just, it does. Shameless plug. So our paper is actually about the role that heritage professionals and international heritage organizations should play in monument removal, which on the face of it looks at odds with our topic today, looking at Ukraine, but I assure you that it's not. So I'm talking about monument removal in the sense that, for example, I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we had a Lee statue come down. But the rhetoric around that, oh, thank you, Helena. The rhetoric around that, how it, the whole process worked, et cetera, and heritage professionals' role or not taking a role is what sort of piqued Damian and I's interest in this topic. So we have put together a policy paper suggesting that heritage professionals do have a role in monument removal, and we outline 3 steps that we think that the process of monument removal should take. So the first one is the planning phase, which covers everything from the nomination of a monument to how it's going to be removed, what's going to happen to the removed materials, what's going to happen to the locus of the removal, the monument area that it used to formerly be erected in. So that's the planning phase. And then we have a removal phase, which is the actual removal, which we advocate should be done in a very transparent way. So we've collected numerous examples where monuments were removed in the middle of the night, which we don't generally recommend, because that is literally the opposite of transparency. And then a post-removal phase, so an implementation phase of the sort of afterlife of the removed monument, the ex-situ monument, and the place where the monument was, the park or what have you in the landscape. And we wrote this paper, and what structured our thinking is the many ways that monuments have been taken down, with particular intensity in the last couple of years. And these things were sort of problems that came up because communities were essentially doing the process on their own without reflection or input from previous removals. And so, for example, where I live in Charlottesville, the park where the Lee statue was is still like sort of empty, and there's still sort of construction tape around the plinth. And there are people still trying to figure out what should be done with that space now that the monument is removed. Our paper suggests that heritage professionals should be working with their communities from the start to facilitate the process of monument, what we call deaccessioning, monument deaccessioning. And we borrowed a lot of techniques and ways of thinking about deaccessioning from the museum space. So that's how we've adopted that term. Now, how this intersects with Ukraine is that I mean, it feels a little silly to point this out, but maybe it isn't. Looting and the deaccessioning of monuments are not the same thing. So if we're going to compare two acts in Ukraine, for example, the Russian removal of Potemkin's remains to Russian-controlled Crimea, and the recent Ukrainian removal of the Catherine II statue in Odessa, one is a monument deaccessioning and one is looting. We see the difference as monument deaccessioning is a small d democratic process. A community decides whether or not they want to have a monument continue to be in their community, in their landscape. And this is where heritage professionals should be advising about how they deaccession things in the museum space. Do they recontextualize a monument, for example, in Ukraine with the recontextualization of the now called Arch of Freedom to the Ukrainian people, which was a formerly monument to their Soviet past that they've now recontextualized by taking out some elements, putting in some new elements, shining blue and yellow lights on it, renaming the monument. So that wasn't a full removal, but a recontextualization. This is the kind of experience that museum and other heritage professionals have that they can bring to these situations. If I go back to the Catherine II statue removal in Odessa, that was voted on by the local people about whether or not they wanted the monument to continue to be in their public space. I feel like this is particularly pertinent for audience members who are very much aware that Odessa was just put on the UNESCO World Heritage Site list. So changes to that landscape is very meaningful for the world. So they voted to remove it. They put in a course of action to do this. They live filmed the removal. They removed the statue carefully. There was no sort of, and I'm sure audience members can think of other instances where statues are like beheaded or sort of smashed. That's not what happened here. And then the monument was shipped off to a museum, and you can watch the removal on YouTube, a public archive. And then they're making plans for what to do with the area of the landscape that the statue was formerly in, to sort of reincorporate that into Ukrainian public space. By contrast, looting, and Sam, I hope we'll get into this more, but looting is a form of exploitation and colonialism of a colonial power against a country, a nation, a people that they want to civilize in the sense of eradicating self-determination. Looting supports that activity, that oppression. And those are huge differences. I mean, the Catherine II statue is going to be made publicly available as a teaching opportunity for the Ukrainians to reflect on their own history and their own future. The same is not happening when Russia loots materials from Ukraine. That is not to allow self-determination. It's not to allow communities to engage in a conversation about who they were and who they want to be. That is oppression, point blank. So anyway, I'll let us carry on, but those are some highlights, and I hope that people take the time to read our brief and get informed on what we think about monument deaccessioning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And now I think that's a good time to turn to your co-author, Damian Koropeckyj. Damian, we were just hearing about the brief that you did with Kate on strengthening the role of cultural heritage professionals in the discussion on monument removal. But in addition to this, you've also done a lot of work on the exploitation of cultural heritage, like Kate was just discussing just now as well. And I was hoping you could elaborate on this, discussing what you're seeing in Ukraine and also put it into a bigger context.
Sure. I mean, you can start pretty simply looking particularly at the case in Ukraine. The president of the Russian Federation, in his speech announcing this new escalation in the conflict last year, specifically cited the removal of monuments in Ukraine as one of the issues supporting these actions. And yet Ukrainian cultural heritage professionals continue to carry on in this democratic, deliberate process. I think that, as Chris mentioned, this is a threat that all cultural heritage workers are going to face in some form in the future. And I think a lot of lessons can be learned from these incredible professionals in Ukraine who've been facing this now for almost 9 years of conflict. And we've seen how these actions have evolved in that 9 years. So comparing certain monument removal from 2015, for example, up until now, we've seen this process that a lot of people can learn lessons from. I think that certainly more can be done. I think a lot of the reasons that such actions can be exploited, going back to our policy brief, is trying to build as much transparency as possible into the process to avoid certain narratives from being built. So I won't name the Baltic state in particular, but one of the countries in the Baltics is going through a similar decommunization process. But the Committee of Cultural Heritage Professionals who are deciding which monuments can be taken down and when is actually classified and unavailable to public access, and the deliberations of that committee are also unavailable to the public, as I understand it, which is understandable. It's being done for security reasons, so that specifically those cultural heritage workers are not targeted by new Russian narratives or any security threats. But at the same time, that already builds an opening for exploitative information to come out to impact both the workers on the front lines of this and also the population that are dealing with these issues. I think that the answer to, dictatorial narratives and exploitation of these issues is, as we've discussed, small d democratic processes and full transparency into undertaking these actions. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And Damian, your comments raise a big elephant in the room, the fact that we don't have any Ukrainian voices on today's webinar. And Dr. Hardy, you're the head of illicit trade research at the Heritage Management Organization, and in that capacity are working on the issue of Ukraine. But I know you've worked a great deal on this issue in other areas of conflict around the world. We're very aware of the gap today and the gap in today's program. And obviously there are the challenges of logistics, not just in time zones, but also infrastructure and access. But I was hoping you could address this problem heads on how the international community can support those in Ukraine, but also, the logistical challenges of continuing to work with our Ukrainian colleagues and how you've managed this in your own work.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very lucky to get to know more and more Ukrainian archaeologists since 2014, and their work has been constantly impressive and ever more so. I mean, I remember even in the first days of the intensification of the invasion last year, I was discussing some shared work with an archaeologist in Kiev, Sergei Telizhenko, and he paused in the middle of a sentence to bluntly express surprise at some explosions outside, and then went back to discussing what he'd been explaining before. And they are now, obviously, some of them serving in the armed forces or in other capacities directly related to the war itself. Otherwise, in caring capacities and in community capacities, as well as continuing with their ordinary professional duties, which now involve so much more in terms of emergency work on top of the work that they have had to do since before the war. And there's certainly been a mismatch in a lot of the international support. there's been a great deal of international support, but at the same time, there have sometimes been offers for materials or other things, which would be very nice if they could be delivered to the places that needed them, but because of the war they can't. There have been offers of support or suggestions for activities for archaeologists in Ukraine, which would have been risky, if not unwise, and obviously not necessarily the kinds of things that can be undertaken in a war with an enemy that does not respect cultural property or human rights. So I think maybe the first thing that the international community needs to do is to let Ukrainians tell them what to do. And that's what I've been trying to do in my work, trying to track things that I knew that my colleagues didn't have the time to do because they were busy with more important things, and trying to share information with them and help them to share information outside, whether it's about expropriation or unlicensed excavation by professional archaeologists, which is another issue that has been a problem since the start of the war and has become more prominent since the intensification of the invasion, or looting by armed forces, by paramilitary organizations or paramilitary fighters, looting by ordinary criminals, which has obviously continued and been tied up with the invasion, both just exploiting the conflict and in the form of collaboration between criminals and fighters, and trying to see how the international community could act against trafficking and thereby reduce the flow of funds, either directly to warring organizations or to participants in the war who were incentivized to participate because of the opportunity to pillage.
Thank you for that. And while you're here, I wanted to tap you for a follow-up question, specifically about the building on your very last comments there, about the looting that is being documented now in Ukraine. Obviously, there's the fog of war, and it's often difficult to get any information, let alone a clear and full picture of what's happening in an area of conflict. You know, I've done a lot of work in Cambodia that we're putting together. You know, it sometimes takes decades to put together the full picture of what happened. And here, people like yourself are working very hard to do this in real time with limited resources. But if you could summarize for us today, the evidence that you've seen, not just in this most recent phase of the conflict over the last year, but even dating back to the earlier Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. What evidence do we have? How are you finding it? How are you navigating these challenges, and what are you seeing?
I mean, I guess, fortunately, in one sense, precisely because Russia is acting in a nationalist imperialist manner, it is advertising some of its crimes in the form of direct expropriation of existing collections, but also in the form of destructive restoration of places like the palace in Crimea, and also in the excavations, which are technically scientific in the sense that they're overseen by professionals, but are not licensed by Ukraine, not monitored and recorded and part of Ukrainian cultural heritage professionals' processes. And there is some evidence that looters are taking part in the excavations partly to train themselves in what to find and how to extract it. But then on top of that, there is evidence of soldiers who are looting as they're digging trenches. There is evidence of paramilitary fighters who are members of black digging groups, which is their proudly self-proclaimed term for criminals. There are cases where Russian nationalist Ukrainian citizens who are looters have supported the invasion and annexation of Crimea, and they've discussed the fact that the overthrow of the local authorities opened up new land to loot. So they were directly benefiting from the change in control, and at least one of them has posted the photo of the medal that he received for his support for the annexation. So you can see that their role was clearly very prominent to be recognized so exceptionally. And then, yeah, you can see even with border guards as well, right at the start of the invasion in 2014, there was an organization of a cross-border looting activity that involved looters in the occupied territories and border guards from Russia. And the one that was publicly documented was looting within Russia. But obviously they're all working together on both sides of the border. So you can see very clearly that there is this disruption of the rule of law, complete rejection of the rule of law by criminals and by state agents across the territories that have been taken by Russia within Ukraine.
And Sam, we have a specific question building on that, which you've answered a little bit already, but in case you wanted to elaborate, when you're talking about the illicit excavations by archaeologists, are these excavations done solely by Russian archaeologists or Russian supporters? Was the question?
Russian supporters as well, or people who simply do not care. I mean, we have to be very clear that there are Ukrainian archaeologists who lived in the territories that have been occupied before the occupation. They're living there now. They are trying to continue their work to protect the archaeological sites, to preserve the heritage of their community. And that is an entirely different, morally opposite endeavor to those that are being engaged in by the archaeologists who are coming into the territories to excavate, to be able to say that they've excavated in Ukraine or to get whatever else they want out of it professionally. And those ones, the incomers, include not only Russians, but others from a range of countries outside. And that has been yet another problem that Ukraine has had to deal with, trying to regulate and discourage that kind of exploitation of their vulnerability without incidentally punishing the Ukrainian archaeologists who are struggling to work under occupation despite occupation.
And also, just for those of you in our audience, please do feel free to use the Q&A function to suggest any future questions for any of our panelists. In the meantime, Kate and Damian was hoping to expand more on the work. We've heard from Sam just now about some of what's happening on the ground there. And Kate and Damian, you've both been taking a bird's eye view at time, looking at satellite imagery and things like that. And I was hoping you could talk about how you're combining that to try to learn more about the situation and what you can see and what you've been able to learn and what we still need to learn.
I'd like to point out first an example that ties into everything we've been discussing so far, which is some of the really open egregious activity that's been going on in Mariupol since it was captured by Russian forces, even before they successfully conquered Mariupol. So even while operations were still ongoing, they were already building new monuments there. And on top of that, you've seen specifically, and I watched some of these instances almost in real time through satellite imagery, monuments, Ukrainian monuments, even newly installed monuments that were being destroyed in Mariupol, with brand new Russian monuments being built exactly on top of them. And again, that's assisted, as Sam was saying, by the very blatant advertisement of these actions by the Russian state in many of these cases. And I'll let Kate speak to that more if you'd like.
Yeah, great point, Damian. For example, the Russians immediately took down the Holodomor Memorial in Mariupol. Obviously, they're currently destroying the Mariupol theater and building something else on that footprint. And like, actually, if I can sort of just tie this right back to Damian and Maya's paper, which is, at some point, the Ukrainians are going to retake Mariupol, and they're going to have to make a decision about what to do with the newly erected new building that the Russians put over the Mariupol theater, whether that's a new theater or whatever, right? Like, they're going to make a decision about what to do with that building. And here's where we very much see the role for cultural heritage professionals. And I'll actually veer towards talking about the role of international cultural heritage organizations in supporting Ukraine now and in the future, and supporting heritage professionals around the world now and in the future who are presented with having to make choices. I mean, this morning, heritage professionals in Istanbul woke up and had to make a choice about whether to save people that they loved or whether to go check monuments that is their entire life's work. We see, Damian and I have suggested that international heritage organizations should be building out guidelines for how to take down monuments. And he and I both see what the Ukrainians have done in terms of figuring out their own process of de-Sovietization or decommunization as full of great lessons learned for how to do this. Because many other communities are trying this out and are running into problems where they're disaffecting the very community that this is supposed to be meaningful for by taking monuments away in the middle of the night and blocking off the square in which the sculpture was present, and then never allowing people, or there's no clear plan about what to do in that space ever again, right? Like I said, the Ukrainians, when they retake Mariupol at some point, they're gonna have to figure out what to do with that new Russian building that's built on the theater. That is not easy for anyone. I am not saying that anyone has the right answer for any of this. And Damian and I wrote this paper in the spirit of discussion and collaboration. And like, what might be good in one community might not fit another community, but at least the later communities should be looking on what other people did and how that went wrong and how that worked out, and understanding that the process takes time. And, there's this black and white thinking when it comes to monument removal, that removal means erasure, or vandalism, and continuity means that this is accepted history and history doesn't change. And neither of that's a false argument, a false dichotomy. Removal does not mean erasure. It doesn't mean vandalism. Preserving monuments or recontextualizing monuments, so changing how the monument looks, or what the monument means, or what the name of the monument, or how the monument is celebrated, those things, it's not accepting history as fixed. And I think we can all agree in this room that oh, thank you, Sam. One of the looters from Russia entered the occupied territories to rebuild Mariupol. Right, exactly. These colonialist narratives are not going away, and we need to figure out like a process for working through decolonization worldwide that involves understanding what these monuments are doing in our landscape, what we learn from them, who we are from them, and whether they should be moved to a museum, whether they should be replaced, whether they should be recontextualized. that this is a learning process, and this is a process of understanding where democratic societies are moving in the future. And, that is something that Russia does not have. They don't have a future. Like, Russia under Putin has no future. What they have is a glorified past, and then they're just imposing misery on everyone that might suggest that the future can change. And so honestly, engaging with these ideas about how to take down monuments in the spirit of understanding who we are as democratic societies, I think like this is maybe the most important work that international heritage organizations can do in terms of leading on this issue, speaking to our Ukrainian colleagues about how they evolved this process. Earlier from 2014 onwards, like the Ukrainian process for removing their own monuments, like it wasn't so democratic in the past. It was sort of a top-down reactionary type of decommunization, and they've moved away from that. And I don't think it's any coincidence that they have become more democratic while their national sovereignty is under threat than beforehand. And that is lessons we can all learn. Sam, you're welcome to.
I was just going to say exactly that. Like, I was in Ukraine and talking to the Ukrainian archaeologists while they were discussing how to manage the blacklist of the incoming archaeologists to the occupied territories. And the process itself was so different from that other countries have gone through when they've been deciding how to blacklist archaeologists. They were very careful. They wanted to learn from others' experiences and to make sure that when they implemented the process, they did it in a manner that was both legal and ethical. And yes, again, absolutely. You can see and you can hear when you talk to them their commitment to democracy and freedom. A friend of mine talks exactly about the war as a project of freedom and has said that he wouldn't have joined and served if it had been a nationalist war. He was a pacifist before he signed up. So I think they do stand as an emblem and as experts who will be able to inform a lot of processes elsewhere as well.
Damian, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to build on some of these with kind of an anecdote, looking at early years monument removal in Ukraine. So 2015 on, looking at specifically their campaign to take down Lenin monuments. I would say that was probably missing that end stage, that were recommendation, that implementation stage. The monuments were taken down by orders of the government, and that was all that was required. They just have to come off their plinth. And without that end stage, I think without some of that closure, we've actually seen now some of these villages that have been recaptured by Russian forces, they've simply picked up those Lenin monuments and put them right back up. And I think that is a great example of what happens when you don't, first of all, when you're looking backwards rather than forwards, but also what happens when you aren't able to kind of fulfill the entire cycle that we're recommending for this kind of process.
Just the conversation today, we're looking at cultural heritage, obviously, with this webinar, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I was hoping, based on the work that the three of you have done, to speak more about this connection we see between crimes against culture and also crimes against people, particularly in the context of war crimes, crimes against humanity, even genocide. If someone could speak to that a little bit to put this in perspective. Any takers on that?
I'll simply say that, looking at the Russian way of war and how it's played out in Ukraine, the objective is to flatten everything in their path. And if that includes a city full of people, that city is also going to include cultural heritage. And so all of those things are going to be in the way of the Russian war machine in that case. And obviously, there's not much more thought than that on the Russian side, I think, in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, what Damian's point, I totally agree with. Like, if we want to compare some of the targeting of cultural heritage in Syria by ISIS compared with what the Russians have been doing in Ukraine, at least. So perhaps in the first week of the war, there seemed to be a little bit more surgical targeting of cultural heritage as a specific category of strategic monument, sort of a strategic asset, Ukrainian asset to target. Very much more similar to ISIS, which was waging a religious war, like a religious civil war against their own people, where they were really excising cultural heritage that represented a plethora of religion or various religious practices that didn't conform to their own strict view of Islam. What we have seen since the Russian, since it's dawned on the Russians that they weren't going to win in the first 2 weeks, is exactly what Damian said. Instead of sort of excising cultural heritage as a specific strategic target, now they're just plowing through anything that is Ukrainian. And that includes schools and hospitals, that includes cities, that includes civilian infrastructure, that includes cities that have no strategic military component or rationale. And so we focus here in this audience on cultural heritage, but for every piece of cultural heritage that is impacted, whether directly or not in kinetic strikes, I mean, there's 10 or 50 other types of civilian infrastructure, power, dams, everything that we would take for granted for living in the 21st century, internet, is being targeted. And cultural heritage is honestly basically the detritus of that wider war. I know we like to think that cultural heritage is being specifically targeted, but actually we would probably gain a lot more support and offer a lot more support to the Ukrainians if we basically got on board with our colleagues who are looking at other types of civilian infrastructure, and we're doing that kind of recording of war crimes and crimes against humanity writ large. They have just more resources on that side of the fence because they're looking at, honestly, more stuff and frankly more important stuff in terms of long-term survival of the Ukrainian people. So not without diminishing the importance of cultural heritage in Ukrainian self-definition here, but, people need power to survive. So, that would be my recommendation. And obviously that's exactly what we've seen in the past 12 months, essentially, is they're taking out whatever they can take out. Cultural heritage is not special in this respect.
I mean, one of the places that we can see the exploitation of cultural heritage is in excusing or trying to reinterpret what Russia is doing everywhere else. So it's using its supposed policing of cultural property crime to present itself as a more patriotic and simply more efficient governor of the territories than Ukraine, even though it's actually catching and releasing the smugglers in return for intelligence. And it's presenting the antiquities that it does choose to seize as things that it's curating and recuperating for its society. And it's even talked about doing it, having recovered as much as was lost through the retention of the collection that was displayed in the Netherlands. So in that sense, it's using cultural property as a tool of propaganda to distract and deny from its genocidal intent.
Thank you. We have a question for the audience, which I would like to open up to the full panel. Considering the difficulties in conducting heritage work in conflict zones and the rightful prioritization of basic human needs over the protections of a heritage, what are some tangible ways that foreign agencies, and this is whether governments or NGOs, can positively impact cultural heritage preservation in Ukraine or other areas of conflict?
Can I just say, inventory the stuff you already have? this work depends on people in communities inventorying what they currently have. Like if you go to Sucho, SUCHO, where you can archive Ukrainian museum websites and other cultural heritage websites, part of the strategic mission behind Russia taking out Ukrainian internet is so everything is stored on the internet. Your cultural heritage inventory at your local museum in Wyoming is stored somewhere on some computer. Everything is. And so not accessing computer or power or internet means that people do not have access to their inventories. Like if there's one thing that we're learning from Ukraine is like, we need to know what we have before we can save it. And that is something that everyone can participate in. Everyone can go to Sucho and donate some of their time to archiving these websites. But like more broadly, like archive the stuff that you're in charge of. I know we're speaking to a room full of heritage professionals who have some inventory and then probably thousands of things that have not been accessioned into an inventory list. Do that work. I mean, ask any Turkish heritage professional this morning if they wish they had inventory stuff yesterday.
Thank you for that. Any thoughts from others to build onto that?
Yeah.
Speaking to Ukraine specifically, I'd like to see a lot more cooperation between international heritage organizations. You're getting a lot of the same asks, I think, from Ukrainian heritage workers on the ground, and I, can't speak for them specifically and what they're asking for, but every big international heritage organization is kind of offering its own solution to that one problem rather than cooperating. And I've seen a lot of redundant work in that regard.
Employ Ukrainians in Ukraine. I mean, I've seen applications for funding get rejected because of the risk to the workers. I mean, like, the risk is the fact that they live in Ukraine. And they're going to do this work anyway because they're voluntarily doing it for their community and their society. The question is whether they can do it safely and quickly and efficiently because they've got the support, or whether they're going to be at greater risk because they haven't got support, or whether the work is going to get done very minimally because it's only being done in terms of what can be done outside, because some places are unwilling, for one reason or another, to cooperate with or support work that's going on in the country.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, some international heritage organizations have written into their mission that, for example, they can't support, or their support cannot go to documenting of war crimes. I'm not saying that mission is wrong, but if strings come attached with support, then we have to understand that the support that is given is not going to be complete. And so the less strings attached, I understand there's a concern of fraud, waste, and abuse, or there's a concern that people worldwide are going to prioritize the same monuments that are important to them, vice what is important to Ukrainians. But we have to trust that people on the ground know how to spend the money that they have in the best ways that they see possible. Like if they believe in the mission, then we have to assume that they're going to make good choices. And so some of these strings attached, like, maybe it's worth reconsidering whether we should offer aid with strings attached. Because again, that's going to limit the power of our time and resources in the country of need.
Thank you. We're coming up at the close of our time. So I just wanted to open it up to all of our speakers and to see if there's any closing points that anyone would like to briefly make before we wrap up today.
I would just like to kind of follow up on Chris's paper for the AC and his comments earlier. Like, it's just hard to imagine future wars not involving the manipulation of heritage and history to legitimize these types of invasions against sovereign nations. So if we are not prepared as heritage professionals around the world to handle this, like we're going to be cut out of the dialogue. We're not going to be able to make recommendations, and we're not going to effectively be able to protect and enhance what culture means to people worldwide. So I know it can feel like overwhelming. It's a depressing picture that we've painted. And also, I'm sure the people in this Zoom room today have a sort of vested interest in Ukraine, but maybe not everywhere. But this is coming for all of us. Frankly, like these narratives they're not going to stop being used. I mean, we can all think about this happening in China, for example. If they invaded Taiwan, they're going to use a historical narrative to legitimize that act. And so getting familiar with this work and being comfortable with the discomfort, and I think is the only way to move forward.
Yeah, if I could build on that, I would never ask a cultural heritage worker to risk their life in their profession, obviously. But I think more important, we all have to acknowledge that they may not have a choice someday. Everyone could be put at risk at some point, considering the way that things are going now. And I mean, not even specifically to conflict, but climate change as well. There are so many threats to people and their heritage now. And I think the first thing to do is, I think what would help every professional kind of build these workflows for themselves is to acknowledge that, yes, everyone is a threat now.
And Sam, we have just a couple of minutes left. If you have any closing thoughts, perhaps on what you see coming in the year ahead, and again, any just last recommendations.
Sadly, I see more of the same, especially since they expect a re-intensification of the invasion in the coming weeks. So I think we just have to brace ourselves for worse and try to prepare now to support them more, because they'll need it more than they already do.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, especially to our speakers today, and to those of you who chose to spend the last hour with us. We do appreciate it. If you haven't seen them already, I encourage you to go to our think tank. You can access it through our website, www.theantiquitiescoalition.org, and check out these papers and others dealing with threats to our cultural heritage. Thank you all again. We do appreciate it, and welcome any questions in the future from our audience. If you think of things later, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much. We'll see you at a future webinar. We appreciate it.